Hello, my name is Squishy Putty. I am a small dragon made of clay, and today I'm going to be talking about XCOM 2, a game that I want to love despite its best efforts. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, despite clicking on this video for some reason, XCOM 2 is the sequel to XCOM Enemy Unknown, which is in turn the remake of XCOM UFO Defense, one of the earliest tactical RPGs. While XCOM UFO Defense helped to give the tactical RPG genre its start, XCOM Enemy Unknown became vital to shaping what the genre is today. XCOM 2 made significant refinements on Enemy Unknown's gameplay. Now that I've established what the game is, it's time to get into the review section. And despite what I've said so far, the game is far from perfect. Let's start with the bad, the things that the game does wrong. The first problem is that rookies are worthless. They have only 4 hit points, which means that they get one-shotted by most attacks, because a typical attack does 3 to 4 damage early game. So if you're lucky, they can maybe survive 1 hit. The second big issue that rookies have is that they aren't very useful. Their weapon is the basic rifle, which, while not bad, isn't particularly impressive either. And other than that, they only get a singular utility item or grenade, which heavily restricts their usefulness in combat. They're not completely worthless, but they're really likely to die before you can actually promote them to make them more useful. The second problem that I want to get into is the 4 main classes of the game, because I have my issues with all of them. Let's start with the most basic of the classes, the Specialist. No, that's not a joke. The Specialist is the most versatile and simple class in the game. They're the only one who continues to use the rifle as their default weapon after becoming a squaddie. Now, I actually really like the Specialist class overall, but I do have 2 significant issues with it. One is that some of their abilities feel like they're kind of given in a strain voida, where what feels like pretty much the main ability of the class isn't gotten until level 3, though it is a really strong ability, so I can understand that even if I don't particularly like it. In case you're curious what ability I'm referring to there, it's Haywire Protocol, an ability that lets you hack into robots. It's a lot of fun, but I wish you could get it a little earlier on. The second issue that I take with this Specialist class is the Combat Protocol ability. You see, the ability isn't worthless, but it does so low damage that it's pretty much only effective against robotic opponents. And for some reason, even though you're sending your drone off to attack the enemy, you still have to have a clear line of sight, which never made a whole lot of sense to me. But other than that, I actually genuinely like this class, which can't entirely be said of some of the others that I'm going to be discussing. Now on to what feels like it should have been the basic, most versatile class in the game, but actually isn't, the Ranger. The Ranger is a stealth and close quarters focused class, which is actually where my problems come from. Firstly, their default weapon, the shotgun, isn't actually all that much better at close range than most other weapons are, which makes it so that their only real advantage at close range is the sword, and you should probably just give them the assault rifle instead of the shotgun half the time. Now, that's just based on my personal experience, and I don't know if that's actually correct. But I've found that it's often not worth upgrading the shotgun at the very least, and better to just give them high-level assault rifles until you have an excess of resources and can spare enough to upgrade the shotgun at no real detriment to your ability to do other things. Now, as for my problems with their stealth abilities, well, firstly, I just don't like the stealth mechanics very much in this game, and I'll explain why in some detail later, but also a lot of them are just not very useful. So, one of them makes it so that when your squad loses concealment, they don't, which, firstly, I feel like is just how concealment should work in this game, but it isn't for some reason. But secondly, I have never, no matter how much I've tried, been able to find an actual use for that ability. It has never come in handy once in the entirety of my playthrough of the game. Now, they have some other stealth abilities which are fine, like being immune to overwatts, which isn't really that big of a deal when you can so easily remove overwatts by just dealing damage to the enemy. But it's not worthless. It's a pretty good ability, even. They also have an ability that lets you regain concealment once per mission, and I found that that one is actually pretty good, since it allows you to safely scout ahead and figure out where the enemies are before you have to actually start fighting them. Now, there is one other big problem with Francis. You see, because they're the melee class and they don't really have any defensive abilities, they often have a hard time staying alive, especially at lower ranks. So it can be very difficult to get them to higher levels so that they can actually get some of their best abilities. Because of this, they tend to be less useful later on unless you've done a very good job at keeping your Rangers alive so that they can rank up. Now, on to the next class. The Grenadier is the heavy class of the game, is what I would like to say about them. The thing is that they don't really have any close quarters abilities or anything to improve their armor, so they're not really very functional as a heavy class. Instead, they have abilities reliant on the use of explosives, which is fine on its own, but becomes a bit of a problem when they're the closest thing the game has to a proper heavy. The other major problem that I have with the Grenadier class is the fact that one of their most useful and important abilities is the one that they get at the corporal rank, so level 2 basically, which wouldn't be a problem if not for the fact that it's possible, if you don't know how important that ability is, to take the other ability instead and then wind up with Grenadiers who are significantly underpowered late on because they don't have one of their most important skills, that being the Shredder ability, which gets rid of armor on the target. The ability works anytime you perform an attack, including with explosives, so it's quite helpful, especially later on when you start dealing with enemies with 3 or more points in armor on them. But again, this isn't their starting ability, so instead you can choose to take an ability that provides 66% protection against explosives, something which the enemies don't use very often, and even when they do, taking reduced damage from them will only help so much. So, basically, you can either get one of the abilities which is necessary to make the class useful, or you can get one that will come up maybe a handful of times throughout the entire game, and will never really sway any battles significantly. And one final thing before we move on to the next class, the Grenadier's starting ability says that it lets them use the grenade launcher to fire grenades farther, but technically that's their secondary weapon. Their actual ability is that they can use a second utility slot for grenades. It's not a major issue, it's just kind of weird, right? Like, it's weird that the ability says that it's just the secondary weapon when it actually does something else. But it doesn't significantly impact the gameplay, so I'm more or less willing to let it slide, but I still thought I'd bring it up because it's just kind of funny. And now, onto the last of the 4 basic classes in the game, the Sarposuda. The Sarposuda is honestly probably my personal favorite class in this game, but that doesn't mean I don't have issues with it. Firstly, it has almost the opposite issue of the Rangers, where they're actually too easy to keep alive, making it way more likely for you to have a high-rank Sarposuda than any other class. Of course, if that was my only problem, I probably wouldn't bother even mentioning this class, because that's so minor that it doesn't really affect how fun they are to use or anything like that, and it's technically beneficial to the class, it's just detrimental to the game's design in some ways. So now, on to what I actually find to be the big problem with the Sarposuda class, and it's their starting ability. Squad Sight. So, Squad Sight, lets you attack at any range, but you still need to have line of sight, and at least one of your soldiers still needs to be able to see the target. Now, I feel like this would be just an ability that is enabled by default. I mean, in many tactical RPGs, That's just how it works. There's no limit to how far you can suit things. Now, if that were my only problem with Squad Sight, once again, I might actually give it a pass. But it isn't. Squad Sight doesn't work on your pistol, which obviously you would never use it on your pistol anyway, but the fact that it doesn't work on your pistol means that it's technically an ability on the sniper rifle, not on the Sarposuda class. So, still nothing too big, but there is one other issue with it. It doesn't say this, but you get an accuracy penalty anytime you attack using the Squad Sight ability. It's about 20%, which isn't anything world-shattering, but it is significant enough to be worth noting, and the ability doesn't actually specify that it has an accuracy penalty, so it's not even being entirely honest. So, any one of these things on their own isn't really that bad, but having all three of them combined kind of makes for a really disappointing and frustrating feeling ability. But enough about my problems with the classes. Let's talk about my problems with the stealth mechanics. XCOM 2's stealth mechanics. They're definitely in the game. They are most certainly mechanics, and they do in fact involve stealth. So, in XCOM 2, as soon as you're spotted by every enemy on the map. And not just the actual soldier who was spotted, your entire team becomes spotted by every enemy on the entire map. Now, that on its own may not actually sound all that bad, but it gets worse. Because not only does every enemy know where you are, but most of them don't do anything with this information. You see, until you see an enemy, they won't attack you, even if they know where you are. This results in a very strange dynamic where your line of sight actually does more to determine which enemies are active than the enemy's line of sight does. Now, I may have made it sound slightly worse than it actually is. Technically, how it works is that once you see any member in a group, that group will become active and will take cover and start attacking you. But until then, they just kind of slowly patrol around, regardless of whether or not your soldiers have been spotted yet. In some ways, I understand why this was done, because it makes it so that you have to progress forwards in order to encounter new enemies, but at the same time, it doesn't really make logical sense, and it results in some frustrating game mechanics, where sometimes you'll move just like a space forward, and all of a sudden, you have 3 extra enemies that you have to deal with that you wouldn't have needed to worry about if you had just not moved. Also, as soon as an enemy group becomes active because you've seen them and you've been spotted, that means that they're going to immediately get to take cover. This doesn't cost them an action from their next turn or anything, it's just something that they get to do for free. It's kind of annoying at first, but you get used to it over time. So that's pretty much my problem with the stealth mechanics, but unfortunately it's not the last problem that I have with this game. The next set of problems is hit points and difficulty levels. Those might not sound like they'd be the same problem, but for all intents and purposes they are. So first, I'm going to talk about my problem with player hit points and the easy difficulty. On easy mode, all of your soldiers get +2 hit points, which might not sound like much, and frankly, it isn't very much. Later game. Early game, on the other hand, it's rather a bit more impactful. Because you see, rookies only start with 4 hit points, so giving them 2 extra hit points is a 50% increase to their base health. Now, if you're worried that I'm about to start complaining about how easy mode is too easy and for losers and babies or something, relax, that's not actually what I'm going to be doing. In fact, I think that every difficulty mode should give your soldiers 6 hit points by default. Why do I think that? Because 6 hit points is mostly luck mitigation when compared to 4 hit points. Because you see, a soldier with 4 hit points can generally survive 1 to 2 attacks, because most attacks generally deal about 3 to 5 damage early game. A soldier with 6 hit points can generally survive 1 attack consistently. They'll never really be able to survive more than 1 attack, but they will almost always be able to survive 1 attack, which would make the game a little bit less luck-based, allowing your strategy to be more impactful. And I don't know if everyone agrees with me on this, but this is a strategy game, and I personally like my strategy games to have more strategy than luck in them. So having it so that some of your soldiers will randomly die when they get sought while others won't isn't really doing it for me. So I would actually prefer that on every difficulty, rookies start with 5 or 6 hit points. So technically this is a good thing, I suppose. There is a difficulty that you can play that makes this less of a problem, at least. But I'm putting it in this segment anyway, because it's related to some problems that I have with the game. Now, onto what's probably my biggest issue with the difficulty levels and/or hit points. You see, on anything other than the medium difficulty level, the basic enemies start getting 4 hit points. Now, what I've said about most attacks early game doing 3 to 5 points of damage doesn't just apply to enemies, it applies to your attacks as well. So now, all of a sudden, you only have a chance of taking out the weakest enemies in one hit, whereas on any lower difficulty, it's basically guaranteed with almost every attack in the game. This, once again, contributes to the game being more luck-based on the higher difficulties. Since the higher difficulties are harder in ways other than just being more luck-based, it makes it so that getting bad luck is an even bigger problem than it is on lower difficulties, and also makes it more likely at the same time. This, in my opinion, is a rather bad combination that results in the game being unnecessarily frustrating on higher difficulties. Speaking of the game's difficulty, let's talk about the difficulty curve for a second, because I have 2 problems with the difficulty curve. One is, it's shape. It's roughly duck-shaped. I mean, maybe that's just me who thinks that, but it's hardest near the start, and then it kind of starts getting easier as you improve your equipment, and then at some point it starts getting harder again, but it never really quite gets back up to how hard it was towards the start. I wish I could say that this odd shape is my only issue with the game's difficulty curve, but unfortunately it's not. Because you see, there's one part of the difficulty curve that's sort of chosen by your accents. Because when you encounter Codexes first is entirely determined by when you first use a Skoldak on an Advent officer, which is something you get to decide. It's necessary to progress the game, but you can do it as early or late as you want other than that. And as soon as you encounter a Codex, they're going to start showing up in every mission from there on out. And Codexes are one of the hardest types of enemies in the entire game. You can access them really early if you research the right texts and do the right things. But this is highly detrimental to you, because all of a sudden you're going to have to start dealing with these enemies that you are not equipped to deal with. Certainly not on every mission. When I first encountered one, it took out like half of my soldiers, and then I had to start fighting them in every mission from then on out. It was extremely difficult for a while until I eventually managed to get good enough weapons to take them out in about 2 hits. But before then, there was a brief period of time where the game was way more difficult than it was supposed to be. Just because I decided to progress the main story quest instead of researching other texts. Now, speaking of the difficulty curve, one of the reasons that it's so strange is because of how useful some of the upgrades you can get are. In particular, the Predator armor. It gives you plus 4 hit points and an extra utility item slot. This doubles the number of utility items you can have, and for your rookie, doubles their hit points. Getting this armor makes the game dramatically easier. There are some other techs that do a similar thing, like magnetic weapons, but this is probably the single most impactful tech in the entire game. Needless to say, when you get it is going to affect what the difficulty curve looks like for you. Speaking of Predator armor, let's talk about this game's engineering mechanics. Most items that you engineer are technically just bought outright instantaneously. The only ones that actually require time to engineer are the ones that you build in the Proving Grounds. And almost all of those require Elerium cores for some reason. So, effectively, even though it takes time, the biggest limiting factor is actually how many Elerium cores you have. Which basically means that you might as well have just been able to instantly manufacture any item in this game. Which, as someone who was rather fond of the engineering mechanics in the older XCOM games, isn't exactly my favorite thing. Also, most of the things that you can build in the Proving Grounds give you a random item instead of one you can choose. Meaning, you might get something really helpful, or you might get something that you're literally never going to use for the rest of the game. Also, none of these can be sold for a profit, so if you get a bad item, then you're going to have to lose resources even if you sell it at the black market. And that works as a great segue to my next problem, which is the black market itself. For the most part, I don't mind it so much, but you do have to fly to it, and it takes a while to unlock. Which are both kind of a little bit frustrating. It's not the worst thing ever, and I understand why it was done that way, but I personally am not a fan of it. I can understand if some other people are, but I don't really know what to say. I just don't like it very much. It's not so much a problem as just preference in this case, I think. Speaking of personal preference, I hate the designs in this game. They're awful. I mean, not all of them, but most of them. Even the ones that I like don't really feel like XCOM designs to me. Though there's a small caveat that I'll put to that remark in the positive section of the video. Probably my single least favorite design in the game is the Sectoids. They just don't look good in this game. They look so ugly to me. I don't like them. I have a similar issue with the Mutants, but not to the same extent. I personally can't help but feel that some of these designs look more like they'd fit in a Doom game than in an XCOM game. And maybe that's just me, or maybe everyone else actually agrees with me, but either way, I personally am not fond of most of these designs. Like, you know, I'm here to suit generic space aliens, not these weird blobby demon-looking things. But maybe that is just me, or maybe other people do think that these look perfectly generic space alien-y. I don't think that's a word, but whatever. Also, not only do I take issue with some of the enemy designs, but I take issue with some of the enemies themselves. So, I'm going to go over those now, and fair warning, this one may take a while, because there's a lot of enemies, and I have issues with quite a few of them. Alright, first up is Sectoids. Sectoids are way too powerful in this game. They have considerably more health than most early game enemies, and they also have psychic abilities, which can be very troublesome. They can reanimate dead soldiers into melee attacking zombies, and they can also do things like cause your soldiers to panic or be mind controlled. The fact that they can mind control your soldiers, even though they show up in the second mission of the game, is rather bothersome. Now, admittedly, technically, this isn't exactly anything new. Sectoids have always been able to do that in this series, but most of the time their psychic abilities are way less likely to work. They seem to have a near 100% success rate here, which is really what the problem is. If these abilities were more likely to fail, it wouldn't really be an issue. And to top it off, for some reason, in addition to being given psychic abilities, Sectoids also have more powerful weapons than the basic Advent soldiers do. So not only do they have all kinds of utility things that they can do to make your life worse, but they also just deal a lot of damage when they suit you. Generally 3 to 5 instead of 3 to 4 like most soldiers do. Well, really it's generally 4 to 5, but sometimes less, I think. I could be wrong on that one, so don't quote me there. But either way, they do a lot of damage, and seem to have pretty accurate attacks. Now, mind you, when I say a lot of damage, I mean a lot of damage for an early game enemy. Late game, it's nothing. Okay, Snake Men. For some reason they're called Vipers in this game, and I hate that. They're stated to be the true form of Thin Men from Enemy Unknown. And they're called Vipers. They changed the name of the Snake Men, who are the true forms of the Thin Men, into Vipers. I don't understand this decision. I do not support this decision. I do not like this decision. I barely even acknowledge this decision. I still call them snake men most of the time, and pretty much refuse to do otherwise.
Go, go, go!
Now, that's not my only problem with this, I just thought I'd get it out of the way first. My bigger problem is probably their grab attack. The grab attack is inconvenient, but not really troublesome, and somehow this makes it worse in my opinion. Because basically, it moves one of your soldiers over to the Snake Man and does 1 point of damage. It also stops them from acting until the Snake Man takes damage, but in practice, it's not very hard to just shoot the enemy once to get your soldier back. And they don't even lose their turn if the Viper, technically, takes damage on the same turn that they used the grab. So basically, it just moves one of your soldiers into a less convenient spot and does 1 point of damage. It's inconvenient, and there's almost no way to dodge it or defend against it, but it's not really very troublesome. It's just kind of annoying. So, I don't really know why this attack was designed this way. Luckily though, that's the worst thing that I have to say about the Vipers. They're otherwise actually a fine enemy. Alright, let's talk about Advent Stun Lances. These guys aren't really the worst, but I feel like they're kind of too fast. It's very, very difficult to properly defend yourself against them, and since early game they can sometimes one-shot your soldiers, that can be a little bit of an issue, but they're otherwise fine. I don't have a whole lot to say about them, but they're probably my least favorite type of Advent Trooper. And now on to Mutants. I don't hate Mutants, but I don't like them very much either. Basically, my problem with them is that they have a melee attack that's pretty much an insta-kill, and they use anytime you use that melee attack on them. And melee attacks are already not all that powerful in this game, so it's sort of unnecessarily nerfing something that was already on the weaker side, just to make one enemy harder. Slightly harder. Because it's not like they're otherwise vulnerable to melee attacks or anything, it's just an ability that they were given for some reason. I don't entirely understand why they were given this counter-attack, and I don't particularly like it. I also don't like the fact that it does 7+ damage, meaning that it will typically 1 or 2-shot your soldiers. Even mid to late game, it does a lot of damage, and it also does 2 stun, meaning that your soldier loses their entire next turn. It's a really frustrating attack, but as long as you can stay away from Mutants so that they can't use this melee attack, they're not really that bad. You know what enemy is that bad, though? You wanna know? It's Codexes. The one that you control when they first sew up. But you don't necessarily know this unless you've watched this video, I guess. But if you're going in blind, you wouldn't know that Codexes sew up depending on your actions and your actions only. So here's the thing about Codexes. Anytime they take any amount of damage, they take 1 extra damage and create a duplicate of themselves, with the same amount of health that they currently have. Early game, if you don't have powerful weapons like Gauss rifles, this is extremely difficult to deal with, because they have a lot of health, so they'll be able to create clones of themselves like 3 to 4 times before you finally manage to take them down, and that's if you're relatively lucky. If you're unlucky, they could take considerably more hits, and the clones can also create clones of themselves. So you really don't want to have to take more than 2 or 3 shots to kill one of these things, or you'll start making a lot of them, and they'll be very difficult to fight. They can also teleport, making matters worse. So you can't just run away from them, because they will follow you. Now, I do feel the need to quickly note that I do actually really like the Codex enemies. It's just that if you encounter them too early, they can be far more difficult than they have any right to be. Alright, I promise we're getting near the end of my complaints with this, but there's a few more things that I want to touch on. One is really quick, it's just, the cover in this game can be really weird. It doesn't always make a whole lot of sense. Like, this is just why does that count as full cover? It doesn't make a lot of sense. The other one is heavily related to some things I was mentioning earlier, which is critical hits. I really don't particularly like that this game even has critical hits, but I especially don't like that critical hits seem to be way more likely to benefit the enemies than the players, because if an enemy gets a critical hit, it may well insta-kill someone, whereas if you get a critical hit, it's just as likely that it will not be lethal as if it was a regular attack. This can happen either because of the attack taking out the enemy regardless if it's a critical hit, or the enemy having so much health that it won't die even if you get a critical hit. Because of this, I find that critical hits tend to be more beneficial to the enemies than the players, and since they're a luck-based mechanic, I don't think that's very good. Now, before we can get to what I like about this game, there's just one more thing that I have to mention, and it's a pretty big problem, actually. But luckily, it only applies if you got the game from the Epic Games Store. If you have any other version, as I understand it, it shouldn't be a problem. But if you specifically have the Epic Games version of the game, then sometimes on VIP missions, the VIP will spawn outside of the map where you can't reach them, thus rendering the mission completely unwinnable. This is, needless to say, quite frustrating. But at least it's only in some versions of the game. Or rather, so far as I know, only in one version of the game. But still, if you're playing that version specifically, it sucks. There's no other way to put it. It's just... it's bad. It's bad. Okay, so that was quite a lot of complaints. Some of them minor, some of them less minor. Nothing too severe, though. Now let's get on to some of the positives. The first thing that I want to say about the positive side of this game is that it's generally a well-designed and entertaining game. It looks fine, it plays fine, it's all pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's good. So, I'm not going to go into as much detail about what works about it, because most of it just is good. There's not that many specific things that are easy to point to and say, that thing is good. But there are some of those, and I'm going to cover those in just a second. Now, I think the first positive I should address is the designs, since I promised to touch on that in this segment. So, not only do I just plain like some of the designs, like the Viper's design, but there are also a handful of the designs that I like in context. That may sound a bit strange, but give me a moment to explain. It will make sense, I promise. So, some of the designs I disliked originally because they didn't feel like designs that made sense in XCOM. But then, eventually, I noticed something, and I realized that they weren't really supposed to look the same as the designs from the older games. But, in a way, they still had the same spirit to them. You see, the original XCOM was based on science fiction movies of the time. Well, science fiction movies and science fiction stories of the time. Specifically the types about aliens for the most part, but periodically influenced from other ones too. The point is that it was based on popular media of the time. And so is XCOM 2. Its aesthetic isn't the same as the older XCOM games, but it's much more similar to something like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or other modern movies and or works of science fiction. So, in a way, it captured the spirit of XCOM better than capturing the same aesthetic would have. Some of the best examples of this are the mechs, which do not look like something that I would have expected to see in an XCOM game, but look like something straight from a Marvel movie. I actually love their designs because of this, even though originally I was relatively indifferent on them. A similar thing can be said for the avatars. They're not the most XCOM-looking enemy, but they're very modern sci-fi movie looking. The same can be said for the designs of the XCOM soldiers themselves, as they have designs that are very strongly resembling that of a typical action movie hero. Okay, so, other than some of the designs, what else do I like about the game? Well, the soundtrack is incredible. It's not like every one of the songs in the game is one of my favorites or anything, but most of them at least work really well in the context of actually playing the game, and a few of them are just great, in or out of context. Now, what about the actual gameplay? Is there anything about the gameplay that I actually like? Well, yes, actually. Firstly, there are some really well-designed maps in this game. And I know that the maps are technically randomly generated, but the way that they're done tends to result in some highly interesting designs where there's lots of terrain that you need to figure out how to best take advantage of. Other than the map design, I also really like the final mission of the game. I won't go into too much detail to avoid spoilers, but long story short, you get a special unit in that mission, and it's really powerful, and it's a lot of fun to use, and the mission has hard enough enemies to make up for the extra power boost, and it's a really good mission, and I like it a lot, and it's kind of one of the main reasons that I advise that you go through the trouble of actually finishing the game if you start it. But that's not everything I like about this game. In fact, I'm saving my favorite thing for last, which is right now. The Psyoperative is my single favorite class in any tactical RPG, or any RPG that I have ever played. They're amazing. Now, why do I like the Psyoperative so much? Well, they get a variety of different useful, more sort of utility type abilities, but they can get a lot of them, and they level up differently from every other soldier type, which makes them rather interesting. Because rather than being more powerful the longer they've been used in the field, they become more powerful the longer you spend training them at your base, which sort of creates an almost inverse relationship from normal, where they can be much stronger if you can avoid using them for more time. Now, how about those abilities I mentioned earlier? What do they actually do? Well, one that they typically, though not always, start with is called Soulfire, and what it does is it's an attack that targets a single enemy and always hits. It doesn't do all that much damage, but it also ignores armor and cover, in addition to having completely perfect accuracy. So it's extremely useful when you just need to do a few more points of damage to drop an enemy to 0 health and kill them. But frankly, Soulfire is one of the more boring abilities that the Psyops get. For an example of a more fun one that they get is that they get an ability called Fuse, which lets you pick any enemy carrying a grenade, even if they're dead, and cause the grenade to explode. This ability isn't actually very helpful, at least on the lower difficulties, where very few enemies carry grenades, but it's a lot of fun to be able to just detonate any explosives being carried by an enemy. They also get a handful of abilities that apply status effects or give them permanent buffs, like immunity to fire and poison. Overall, depending on what skills you give to the Psyops, they're probably the single most versatile class in this game, including the previously mentioned Specialist, while also being able to be one of the most specialized classes if you focus on a specific set of abilities. Overall, this fact, combined with the fact that most of their abilities are on a cooldown, makes it so that they're one of the most fun classes to play, not only in the game, but in any game. Alright, now it's time for my final thoughts on the game. So, I really like the original XCOM UFO defense, and that might not sound relevant, but give me some time to explain. It was my first tactical RPG, and it's what got me into the genre. I've put a lot of time into the game, and it feels almost like it was designed just for me with how much I like its mechanics. So, I have a lot of positive memories associated with it. And to me, XCOM 2 just felt different. But I realize that a part of that is just that it's designed to appeal to an audience that I'm not as much a part of as I was the audience of UFO Defense. That doesn't mean it's a bad game. It just means that it's not the same to me. But I really do hope that it can give that same experience to other people, the people who it is designed for. So, with everything bad and everything good in mind, I think that the game gets a solid 8 out of 10. It's generally a good game. If you like tactical RPGs, you should probably give it a try. If you specifically like the older XCOM games, UFO Defense Through Apocalypse, you might be better off playing something else, like Phoenix Point or Xenonauts, but you'll still probably have a good enough time with the game. Just go in knowing that it's not really the same as the older ones. Well, that's everything I have to say about XCOM 2. I hope you enjoyed listening to me ramble about it for a half an hour.